Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's 3:05 on my end, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us for considerations for engaging first-generation students in collegiate recreation with Dr. Brett Bruner. Again, another huge thanks to all of our sponsors for making this conference possible in our virtual environment. If you haven't already, I believe everyone was muted upon entry, but just make sure we stay muted throughout the session, using that chat box to ask any questions along the way. As well as I believe we'll probably have some QA towards the end of the session. And I'll pop in towards the end to also post our evaluation. With that, I'll turn it over and just thank everyone for being here today.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to chat with you today about considerations for engaging first-generation college students in collegiate recreation. My name is Brett Bruner. I have the privilege of serving as Dean of Student Engagement at Arkansas Tech University. And I have been in the first generation space for the past several years. And it's a space that I'm excited about. And really, I feel like over the last year or so, really began to think about how do we bring this conversation of our work with first generation student success and that intersection of first generation work into multiple functional areas. So within my role at Arkansas Tech University in the Division of Student Affairs, I have the privilege of getting to work with a number of great teams, including our campus recreation team. I see a couple of them on this call as well. I also supervise our diversity and inclusion, campus life, international student services, and residence life team. So I'm really excited to be able to dig down into what does this mean for first generation college students. I also, for the past 3 years, have had the privilege of serving on the National Advocacy Group for the National Center for First Generation Student Success, which is a collaborative effort between NASPA and the Suter Foundation to really advance our work with first generation. And so really excited to be able to dive into what does this mean? What do we know about first gen students? It was a topic of my dissertation research, really looking at first generation students pre-college, and then as they arrive on college campuses, what does that mean? And then what are really the implications in this case for our functional area within collegiate recreation? So a brief overview of where we're going to go today. We're going to begin with really understanding some of that terminology. We may throw around terms like first gen, which we will learn is a definition challenge in amongst itself. But then also social capital, you might hear some of that terminology, or deficit or asset-based thinking when we think about first generation work. Then really diving into understanding the experiences, the lived experiences of first generation college students across our campuses. And what does that mean? What are the implications for that work within collegiate recreation? And then how do we translate that work into our work with campus recreation? And I am not an expert in first generation. I am definitely not an expert in campus recreation. But my challenge is, and this is one of my challenges anytime I speak about first generation work in any functional area, is how are we going to move hashtag first gen forward? You will quickly learn to see that that hashtag is growing, whether it be in the social media circles, that hashtag first gen forward. And what does that mean for your work on your campuses? And so I'm excited to be a facilitator of this conversation today. So hopefully some learning outcomes be able to take away from this session. Hopefully you'll be able to at least walk away from this session being able to describe the lived experiences, either nationally or regionally, navigated by first generation college students. Hopefully you can be able to take some of those findings and start to think about, what data do I have on my campuses? Who are those campus partners I need to chat with so we can best learn about the lived experiences of first generation college students at your campus. We're going to dive into probably a great, will probably become a seminal work in the world of first generation students. First generation student success, a landscape analysis of programs and services at four-year universities. This was a study that came out about 2 years ago, summer of 2018, from the Center for First Generation Student Success, and really provided some of those base level paradigm shifts for us, regardless what functional area that we work in terms of how are we rethinking the way we're approaching our first generation college students on campus. And then hopefully today, I want to spend a lot of time really doing some crowdsourcing, really diving into you all as a community of peers to really identify, answering the question, so what? How does this articulate to the work that we're doing in collegiate recreation to best engage our first generation college students? So we're going to dive right in to terminology. And I want this to be an engaging session as well. So if you have thoughts or questions, please put them into the chat box. I'm going to look to my session moderator or host peers because I'm not always able to see that chat box the way this screen is set up. But if there are things where we need to stop and have a conversation, let's dive in and have a conversation. So terminology, as I articulated before, is sometimes challenging because there is not a general standard definition of first-generation college students employed across the nation. I will say this, the definition that many campuses utilize, but it's not the definition, is the definition provided on your screen here by Ward, Siegel, and Davenport. This is probably utilized on several college campuses, and that's a student for whom neither parent either attended college or attained a baccalaureate degree. The challenging part becomes some campuses may define first generation as the first to go to college. Some may define it as the first to graduate from college. Some may define it as, well, what happens if a student may have a parent who's attained a bachelor's degree, but maybe was not raised by their immediate parents. And so we begin to factor some of that in. We are beginning to see more of a trend about maybe it's for neither whom parent obtained a baccalaureate degree in the United States when we think about our international students. So there's a lot of challenges when you even think beginning to define first gen. So my charge to you, if you walk away from this session with nothing else, go back to your campus, find the right campus partner and ask, do we have a definition that's employed at ABC campus or XYZ college? Because if your admissions office is collecting it one way and your financial aid office is using the FAFSA paperwork another way and your TRIO office is using a different definition and you're not using the same definition, it's going to be hard to figure out what are the lived experiences and how do they translate to our work within collegiate recreation. Now, on the flip side, before I started doing my doctoral research work 5 years ago, I didn't really know that there was a word for a non-first generation college student, and that would be a continuing generation college student. So if I use that phrase today, that's a student who has at least one parent who has obtained a four-year college degree. So we will use that terminology today of a continuing generation college student. Some other terms that we might be using today. We routinely hear, and this will come up in a few minutes when we start talking about the lived experiences, we hear deficit thinking. And deficit thinking is a concept that is routinely applied to first generation college students. It's that notion that students are maybe at risk. And I hate the word at risk. I work in student success, retention, all those pieces. I hate the word at risk, but they are at risk because they may be deficient in something. In this case, not having either parent attended college. That's a deficit mindset when we think about working with first generation college students. And we'll talk a little bit about in this session, how do we shift that mindset to more of an asset or a strengths-based mindset rather than a deficit mindset. And that strengths-based thinking is, how do we focus on what's present and not what's absent? How do we focus on harnessing the power, the motivation that so many of our first generation college students have, rather than focusing on seeing them immediately as at risk because they didn't have a parent attended college. So now we got terminology out of the way. We're going to dive into perhaps my favorite part of this whole piece is really understanding the lived experiences of first generation college students. I am happy to send all of these slides, including my notes. A lot of this is from my dissertation research, massive amounts of lit review to understand the pre-college and into those first 6 week lived experiences of our college students. So if you're interested afterward, happy to send any and all notes, slide decks, and materials when we to really digest this whole part. So when we understand the lived experiences of our first generation college students, we know that studies show that first generation college students are more likely than continuing generation college student peers to have immediate pre-college characteristics that may put them at a disadvantage. They sometimes have less pre-college information. They may view themselves less confident to attend college. And for many first generation college students, in an article developed by Engel, Bermeo, and O'Brien, students articulated, first generation college students said that preparing for and going to college was a leap of faith because for them, no one else in their families had done it before. So they felt like they were really taking a chance on themselves. But for many first generation college students, they often cite that lack of pre-college information. So when they're thinking about college going fairs and even the admissions decision-making process, that lack of pre-college information really influenced their decision of which college to attend, what kinds of academic or social choices to make while in college, even so much as maybe what major to declare once they get to college. So we know that those pre-college experiences are influencing their work when they arrive on their campuses. However, we also know that first-gen students often recognize and acknowledge that they're going to need assistance when they get to college, even just to navigate the college environment. So for us as college administrators in general, we have the opportunity to shift this paradigm, to reframe this thinking. How do we harness the motivation that students have to attend college? For many first-generation students, and I don't know how many you interact with on a day-to-day basis, but for so many of them, if you talk to them, their motivation to attend college is to bring honor to their family members. So how do we harness those backgrounds to serve as a source of strength as they're learning how to and then navigating college itself? It's a great opportunity for us to help them and ourselves shift that mindset. So we know that a transition for any of us is at an event or non-event that's perceived as significant by a student. Something occurred, something was anticipated and didn't occur. For too many of our first generation college students though, they have cited that the transition into college, that transition from going from high school to college, was the most difficult transition that they faced in the entire 4 or 5 years of going to college. That transition into college, those first 6 weeks were the most difficult that they've ever had to face. For many of them, it's that experience of being associated with the first in their family to attend college, and they begin to think that they're surpassing those accomplishments of their family members, and they may start feeling some family achievement guilt, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. We're talking about some of the mental health experiences of our first generation college students. But too often, first generation students just feel like they are having to navigate this alone. They're feeling isolated. They don't feel that they have a sense of community or peers. And I think that's where all aspects of higher education, but especially those of us in collegiate recreation, have that opportunities to start building sense of community around shared interests. Doesn't matter if you're a first generation or you're the 15th generation of a family to go to college. If you have a shared interest in XYZ area, we're reframing, we're shifting that narrative, we're building a sense of community. First generation students tend to thrive in academic courses that are very concrete in nature, whereas continuing generation students, those who have at least one parent with a bachelor's degree, said, I prefer classes that challenge me to think in more abstract ways. There's not a right and a wrong, there's shades of gray. And so that becomes a source of challenge as first-gen students are navigating the college environment. They want something very concrete. So how does that parlay into our work with campus recreation as we're thinking about, there's maybe not always a concrete way, but it may be more abstract. Some of our work may be concrete, and that's great. If that's the route if that's the program we're working with, we have a great opportunity to harness that and provide that as a pathway of involvement for our first-gen students. Engaging with faculty and staff is an area of concern for first-gen students. First-gen students have routinely cited that they are hesitant to engage in a conversation with a faculty or a staff member because they view that faculty or staff member as an expert in that subject matter. And they don't feel that they have the confidence in themselves to engage in a conversation with an expert. However, when we can break down those barriers and we can facilitate conversation in a casual setting to really connect first-gen students with faculty and staff members, that's when first-gen students find a source of transitional support. Especially female first-generation college students find that source and can have articulated that source of support in a faculty or staff member that helps them make a connection or helps them succeed while they're in college. Ultimately, though, it's those interpersonal relationships. First-gen students feeling that they are having to do this alone. They don't have authentic connections with others. They feel they're isolated. And so sometimes that leads to less involvement on campus, less connections on campus, less utilizing campus resources. So we have that opportunity to think differently in terms of how we're connecting them, how are we providing them spaces to authentically connect with others, to develop that sense of community and the sense of peers, so they're not feeling like they're having to do this alone. When we think about some of the health and well-being experiences associated with our first-generation college students, we see first-gen students routinely articulate that social class achievement gap, or that is that feeling of I'm achieving something that maybe my parents did not achieve. And so they're starting to articulate some of these experiences. We see a lack of sense of belonging on campus. So that feeling of isolation, lack of self-confidence is routinely cited by first-generation students as they're navigating both the co-curriculum and the curriculum in college life. Imposter syndrome, routinely cited by first-generation college students. Imposter syndrome is that feeling of they're never feeling confident, grounded, or socially connected to the campus experience. They're feeling like I'm here, but I'm really just maybe, should I really be here? We also see that tied very closely with family achievement guilt. So students feeling guilty because they're earning the opportunity to attend college, and in doing so, they're surpassing the achievements of their family members. So we see that routinely cited. But when we can shift this mindset of our first generation college students, those first gen students who were successful in persisting and thriving shifted that mindset from that deficit thinking of themselves to one of independence, motivation, and responsibility. We start to see resilience being noted by our first gen students as that shift. Students who are more resilient in overcoming setbacks were more likely to persist to college and ultimately graduate. So what's that challenge? How do we help them shift that mindset as we're shifting that mindset ourselves? The challenge part becomes in here is students aren't doing this alone. And for first generation college students, the family context is a particularly central reference point amongst many of our first generation college students. First gen students, when they're going to college, feel that they're routinely caught between home and school choices. Perhaps, they may feel that they're deviating from the traditional family expectations, although they know that they're striving to bring honor to their family, which is their motivation to attend college. They're really stuck in this world of college life and family life. I think one of the best analogies that's been written about this new dynamic between parents and families and first generation college students was articulated by Nichols and Islas in 2016. And it's an analogy of being pushed versus being pulled. And Nichols and Islas identified that students whose parents had at least a bachelor's degree, so our continuing generation students, they described that they feel that they are pulled through their college experience by their parents with specific pieces of advice about how to succeed, where to go to get your questions answered, what's going to set you up to be successful, to put on that resume, how do you find friends? Whereas first generation students feel with all the love and support that they're more being pushed through their college experience with support of their family members, but they don't feel that they've got that social capital that's pulling them through. They're still having love and support, but they're having to lead the way themselves. So that my charge is with you, and I had the same conversation last week with the National Student Employment Association, and their conference was, how do we shift that? How do we provide resources from our functional area about tips and resources to all parents, but especially to our parents and families of first generation college students, so they can lead with the resources. They can lead with polling, ways to get involved, ways to get connected, resources from their campus or collegiate recreation center to provide those connection opportunities for their students rather than being more reactive and trying to push them through. So what does this mean? What does all of this mean on our campuses? This is a slide that I borrow from my colleagues in the Center for First Generation College, the Center for First Generation Success that I've been able to present with them. What this means here is we see some quotes. So as the Center for First Generation Student Success was launching the landscape analysis, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, for many of our first generation students, it's that internalizing that first gen identity. We see that Anna here is talking about, it's a moral responsibility when I go to college. I'm the only child. I don't have anyone else to lean on. It falls on me. First generation means I have to get it done. Molly is another good example. Molly talks about that she realized when she was first gen, when she came and moved in, everybody else was their moving day. They had their parents, they had their carloads of stuff, and she was there with a suitcase. And that was when that identity kicks in for them. And Marco from Cornell also talks about, how do we help our students realize that they belong here? You went through the exact same admissions process as everyone else. You deserve to be here. So that's the charge for us. How do we shift that mindset? And the Center for First Generation Student Success is an amazing resource. I've used so many resources from them. They are a free resource for all evidence-based practices. One of the most paramount resources that was, I think, a couple-year process was the First Generation Student Success Landscape Analysis. You can download this full report completely for free, and it will really showcase what are we seeing on our campuses. The First Gen Landscape Analysis has 8 recommendations, and these recommendations apply for multiple functional areas, regardless where you sit. So whether you sit in the admission space, the registrar space, or somewhere in between on our college campuses, all of these apply to our work. So some of these 8 recommendations, I'm going to go through these very, very quickly so we can dive into the, so what does this mean for our work? The first piece is that definition. If you don't know how your campus defines first gen, before you can start figuring out how can we best, what are the considerations we need to think about on our campus to more closely engage first gen students in our work, you got to know what the definitions are. And so that's asking the right people. My guess is your admissions office is probably collecting it in some form or fashion on an admissions application. My guess is your I know your financial aid office is collecting that information through the FAFSA, and that's whether or not that's being shared in your institutional research office. But how are you also making sure that your campus may be using the first to go and you're using the first to graduate, or vice versa? I've been on campuses where that was a challenge and we weren't all speaking the same language, literally. So how are we defining to make sure that we're all using that same language? As you begin to then dive into what are the lived experiences, what dark data exists on your campus, because my guess is you have dark data. Every campus that I've been on, there's data that we know about how many first-gen students swipe into our programs or are part of an intramural sports team. You need to start thinking about that intersectionality. And this is what the first-gen student success landscape analysis calls that first-gen plus. So we can't automatically assume that on every campus, first-gen equals Pell eligible students. There might be some intersection, but one is not always the same. First-gen plus minority. What does that intersectionality look like on your campus? First-gen plus LGBTQIA, first-gen plus transfer, first-gen plus commuter. The list goes on and on. So consider that intersectionality as you're diving into your data, as you begin to think about how do we best engage first-gen students on our campus. How do we shift to that asset-based lens? So how do we move away from deficit thinking? And instead of saying, well, they're an at-risk student, so we need to be monitoring them more closely, or we need to, whatever that might be, how do we take that upon ourselves to shift to that asset-based lens? Instead of focusing on the shortcomings, how are we helping the students use their talents to enhance the college experiences? It's a cultural shift. How do we even shift that in our language? So maybe it's a student worker in our office, or maybe it's an intramural official, or maybe it is said any number of other students in our areas. How do we help them if they disclose that they're first gen? Because it's an identity that's not a visible identity. A first gen student doesn't walk around with first gen, stamped across their forehead. After they disclose that, how do we help have those one-on-one conversations that say, this is such a great honor that you're here. Like, let's be proud of that identity. Or if you were a first generation student yourself, how do you harness that identity? I've seen some people where they add that proud first generation graduate on their signature block or on a placard outside their office. How are you modeling that way to really shift that narrative? Small, simple thing that you can do to shift that narrative to be one of honor and pride and motivation. One of probably the most challenging pieces, and this goes well beyond first gen, I think in students in general, is there's this conversation about how do we shift from expecting students to be college ready to we as campuses being student ready. So what does that look like when we think about our processes, our practices? How are we really shifting that we are prepared to be student ready? I think one of the best examples of student readiness is really doing an audit of our jargon. And I think a jargon audit is important not only for our first gen students, but I think any of our students in general. I think sometimes I'm going to use the lens from a university level. We use words like registrar, provost, bursar, things like that any student might be like, I don't know what that means. My charge to you is look, how do you go through? Have you had anybody conduct a jargon audit recently on your webpage? Are there phrases or terminology that we are using that maybe is not student ready? We did this exercise. I had this exercise done at Arkansas Tech University. Our staff across the entire Division of Student Affairs did it last spring, and I use our health services example. They did an audit and they said, wow, we're using a lot of medical terms that we thought were very understandable across the board, but when we have the opportunity to take 5 or 10 minutes and look at our webpage, we're like, maybe we need to just not try to be as medical and maybe try to be more common terminology. So that's an easy charge in terms of if we're truly going to shift to be student ready, how are we trying to be less technical in our language and jargon and maybe just more everyday speak. When we think about one of the recommendations of cohort and network service approaches, so I think it's very easy to fall into the trap on our campus of, well, first gen is that work that's being done in the TRIO office. If you have our campus that have a TRIO or student support services, yes, that work is being done within a TRIO office, but most of those programs are cohort based. They may be only able to take 30 or 40 or 80 students. My guess is you have more than 30 or 40 or 80 first generation students on your campus. So how are we taking this approach that first gen work is all of our work? We want as many first gen students to realize that they have the opportunity to engage in a fitness class. They may not know that your fitness classes are free. They may not know that they can participate in an intramural sports, or how do they find an intramural sports team? So how do we make sure that we're not just relying upon, well, it's that office because there's a cohort or a scholarship grant or whatever it might be. It involves the entire campus networking together to serve this approach. How are we being proactive rather than reactive, I think is key. I think the other piece here, I'm going to run through these very quickly, is who are those primary advocates on your campus? Do you have that go-to person that maybe is in your back pocket within your student staff or on your professional staff team that maybe has that visibility influence? We all have those people, whether we articulate it or not. We all know that there's that person who may be able to get more students to sign up for this just because of the nature of that individual. So how are we appointing those individuals as a first generation advocate within your areas? Always helping us challenge to think about, what does this mean in terms of our language or ways we're reaching students or ways we're reaching parents and families? So how do we appoint those with the visibility and influence within your teams? I think I'm going to kind of really run through this. Really, the only piece I'm going to talk about here is this fourth bullet point of understanding the reaches and gaps of existing resources. If you were to, the landscape analysis articulated that there's a lot of work being done across the nation from first gen, but very few campuses are fortunate that they have a standalone first gen office with the budget that they want, with the full staff that they want. So it truly is the work of all of us across campuses. And I say this because understanding the reach and gaps of our existing resources, not one person can really make this entire shift to really come first gen forward on a single campus. We all have to work together. So my question is, my charge is going to be, what seat do you have at that table of the work being done on your campus? Those of us in college rec, in collegiate recreation, we have this opportunity when we think about the health and the well-being and some of those authentic connections that first gen students have cited that they're lacking. We provide connection in those spaces. So you can articulate, I can have a seat at this table because we can help fill in these gaps that are articulated by our first gen students. So I think if you can articulate that and can have a seat at the table to really change what first gen forward looks like on your campuses, that's a great thing to have in your back pocket. So I encourage you to advocate for that and have a seat around that table so you can then work across the campus rather than feeling like we have to do all this work alone. So what? So I've done a lot of the talking here, and I want to be a facilitator of this conversation. I by no means consider myself a first gen expert, and I am definitely, I'm looking at my coordinator of campus rec who is on our team, who's on this call here. So Carrie, shout out to you from Arkansas Tech. But so what does this mean? And how do we begin this conversation? How does this translate into our work within campus recreation? And we think about, this is what the data says, but what does that mean in practice? So I've just got a few considerations for us to start thinking about. And so I'd encourage you, if you feel like you want to unmute yourself or you want to type in the chat window, love to really facilitate a dialogue here in terms of what this means. So I guess the first piece that I will bring forward, that I bring forward to any of the offices that I supervise is jargon. When we think about being student ready, that's one of the first easy steps that we can take is doing that jargon audit. Do we utilize jargon on our campuses that may not be as well known to our first generation students? And so what might be some of the jargon that we utilize in publications or websites or manuals? Is there jargon that we're utilizing that may be confusing and is maybe not as student ready? Great question, Chris. Chris typed in the chat box, does intramural sports make sense to a first gen student? It's a great question. Sorry, I think someone was going to unmute themselves, it sounded like. Technical fitness terms, great. Yeah, Chris provided a great suggestion of maybe using team sports instead of intramural sports. Yeah. Carrie, I appreciate that you have to explain it to them every time. Yep. Taylor, thank you for sharing. Taylor sharing that first-gen student, they had absolutely no idea what intramural sports meant when they got on campus. Difference between intramural and club sports, natatorium, yeah. So a great easy step that can be done when you walk away from this is to engage your team in a jargon audit. Almost any resource, I'm telling you, this is something like if you were to pay a company that comes in and says starting point, don't pay them to start this. I'm telling you, their first step is going to say, do an audit of your jargon and see what's confusing, or ask a student and say, here's our publication. You tell me what's confusing. That's a great starting point when we think about the considerations for more deeply engaging first-gen students in our work. And that definitely then leads itself into that second piece of expecting students to be college ready versus us being prepared to be more student ready as higher education institutions or functions themselves. So think about all of our processes, procedures, protocols. Are there some of those that we can shift a little bit for us to be more student ready rather than expecting students to be college ready? So are there confusing processes in place or practices?
Hey, Brett, I apologize. I logged in on the NIRSA account because I had to do a session monitor earlier. So off the first question, though, I think even recreation can fall under that. I mean, they may not even know what that is. But then even with COVID, you look at stuff like a reservation system through IM leagues and how is that eliminating all college students? I mean, I know that our topic today, but it can go that far as well. And then you say IM leagues and they're like, what is that? So even to the systems or procedures that we've got and it's really challenging.
Absolutely. Carrie provided a great example in terms of rather than calling it IM leagues, calling it the ATU Rec app has helped a ton. Great example, Carrie. So this third consideration that I might bring up is this concept of switching from deficit-based approaches or deficit thinking to asset thinking. And this is truly more maybe individualistic. It's maybe not more at a departmental level within your recreation center or program, but maybe how do you personally or our team members, how do we get them to shift this mindset of viewing a first-gen student as a deficit for something that they're lacking and instead use it as an asset base, and we're bringing honor to that identity of first gen. What do you think that might look like in practice? So I'll use a simple one there. So as I shared earlier, really over the last year or so, I've seen it become more of a trend on many college campuses that as staff or faculty, but in this case, we're going to use staff who maybe were first-gen students themselves, adding it as part of their signature block, proud first-generation college graduate. That takes you like 5 seconds right now. If you or any of your team members within your campus recreation department identify as that, adding that to your signature block, because you are right now shifting that mindset yourself. You're not viewing yourself from a deficit lens, you're viewing that from that asset lens. And so how can, in that way, as students might be seeing like, oh, hey, Carrie, like, talking to you, like, I noticed that in your signature block. Tell me more about what that means. Oh, and then I've seen students then bring up, well, I was a first-gen student. I am a first-gen student myself. So that takes 5 seconds to add that to that signature block. That really is that shift of you're bringing honor to yourself, and that may be a starting point conversation for other students that you work with. How else do you see playing out in your rec services program in terms of shifting from this mindset of viewing first gen as deficit to instead viewing it as asset-based approach? Another suggestion I might bring to the table is what is your recreation services involvement with National First Generation College Celebration Day? So if you did not know, every year on November 8th, although this year November 8th falls on a Sunday, every year on November 8th, for about the last 3 or 4 years, that's the day that nationally is designated as National Celebration Day to celebrate our first generation college students. It really was started, maybe led by our colleagues in TRIO programs, and then there's been a lot of movement. We've seen more orientation offices, admissions offices be a part of this, but I would argue that on most of y'all's campuses, you probably are engaging probably more students than a lot of other functional areas. And so how are you involved on that day? Is it a simple social media post on that day from your campus rec social media accounts that on that day giving a shout out to all first gen college students? Because that's that great way of saying, we're not going to view first gen as deficit. We're going to celebrate you on this day. We're going to bring excitement. We're going to publicly say thank you and celebrate with you all on November 8th. Now, granted, I know this year looks a little bit different. Probably many of your first gen college celebrations look very different in fall of 2020. But even a simple social media post on those days is a great way to show that you and your team are shifting from deficit to asset-based approaches. So one of the biggest pieces of when I think about the research that I've done with first gen students is too many first gen students feel this feeling of, I feel like I have to do college by myself. I don't feel like there's anybody else like me. I don't have a connection to my peers. I feel like I don't have a sense of belonging. So how does that factor into our work within collegiate recreation? This feeling of first gen students feeling like I have to do college by myself. I'm not connected. There's no one else like me. How does that influence our work in collegiate recreation? Ken provided a great comment in the chat box there. Reinforcement of that building a community. So how do we then reframe the way we share our message about the jargon that we talked about in consideration 1, how do we reframe that message that you be more intentional in our outreach and marketing about creating that sense of belonging in our campus rec centers. So whether it be hosting events for first generation students or articulating that if you like badminton, you've got a community of others who want to be a part of the badminton club sport, or if you like whatever else said program or service, you're automatic. There's built-in connection opportunities there. So it's allowing us to think differently in terms of our marketing and outreach to be able to articulate the ways that students can find. I think that they can find those communities that they're feeling like they're lacking. Love that. Posting quotes from other students that have found their communities through your programs, that found their people, they found their connection with others. I think that's a great idea in terms of shifting your marketing strategies slightly. You're not coming out and saying like this marketing strategy is to market to our first gen students, but if you can provide those student testimonials, the quote, that 30-second Instagram story about how they found their people from your programs or your services, absolutely. Absolutely, yes. Agreed. You are so much more than rec sports people. You are those advisors, those mentors, those counselors. Absolutely. So how do you help them? And that's a great point in terms of going back to one of those earlier research data points is how do we break down the walls? How do we provide students the opportunity to go up and have a conversation with you? I like to say as a human being, without feeling like they don't have to be the expert to go up and have a conversation with you, because we know that first gen students feel that they sometimes lack having conversations with faculty and staff because they view you as an expert. But when we can break down those walls, that's when they find sources of support, student success support, transitional support in our faculty and staff. So how do we break down those walls that you're more than just the rec sports person? And I don't know that answer, but how do we break down that wall so that they will engage in a conversation with you? So just a few. Great, can provide, and how do we ensure that we hire students who reflect as many communities as possible? Absolutely. And I think that that's a great segue into consideration 5, which is all about that social capital and networking. We know that all students are gaining social capital when they're in college. First-gen students don't maybe articulate the social capital that they're gaining. So how do we provide those spaces, that networking space? How we're giving them those access to resources, the connection, the opportunities through their student employment, through their engagement within our programs and our services that are exposing them to the social capital and the networking that will set them up at the same level as their continuing generation college student peer when they're graduating. So how are we helping them articulate the skills they're gaining through their student employment, through their involvement on a team or a club sport? How are we making sure that they are recognizing what they're gaining from that experience? They can articulate that same set of experiences through interviews, through internships, but they can articulate the same set of experiences that a continuing generation student's parent may say, well, yeah, did you list more than just saying on a bullet point, I work the front desk of the campus rec center, but tell me more A, B, C, and D duties that you've done in that. So how are we making sure that we are exposing our first gen students that we hire or that are engaged with our programs to that social capital and to the networking experiences? So maybe that an alum or a former student who now works in maybe the same type of career field that one of your current student employees is going into. We're exposing them to those networking experiences that maybe just comes inherently to our continuing generation college students. And the last consideration that I'm going to bring forward, and I'm going to turn it over to you when you think about considerations, is a seat at the first gen table on your campus. So I guess my first question is, do you know who's driving the first gen bus metaphorically on your campus? And does campus rec have a seat on that bus or a seat at that table? So if you don't know who is driving the first gen bus or is gathering people around the first gen table on your campus, my first charge is go back and ask who's leading the first gen efforts on our campus. And if you don't have a seat at that table, how can you articulate that campus rec should have a seat at that table? I think one of the biggest things to keep in your back pocket, I feel like I'm giving you some of those, whenever I go to a conference, I'm always looking for the nuggets of information. So one of those nuggets is you provide, someone said earlier, you provide the space and the connection opportunities for students to find their people, to find those authentic connections through our programs and our services. And that's what first gen students are lacking. They feel like they're having to do college on their own. They're lacking a sense of peers. Just by the nature of rec sports or campus rec programs, you provide those spaces of students who are interested in the same sport, who like the same type of activity, who want to do the same type of activity. So you provide that, and that provides you. I know as a person who leads the first gen work on my own campus, if Carrie were to come to me and say like, hey, like I'd love to have a seat at the table because we provide the connection opportunities for students to form those connections, it'd be very hard for me to say, oh, okay, well, no. But so my hope is you can go back and advocate for a seat at that table regarding your commitment to advancing and moving first gen forward on your campus, because you provide those connection opportunities that first gen students are saying that they're lacking. They're feeling like they're having to do college by themselves. Before I get to my final couple slides here, one of the pieces that I want to share is, too often we think about any group of people that I'm talking to, people feel like they have to do first gen work alone on their campus. And I was that person, I don't know if you were a Legos person growing up. I love to play with Legos. But I like to say this example up here on the top right, that is not a very fun way to play with Legos when you line them up and they don't intersect at all. But unfortunately, that's too often how many of our campuses approach first gen work. It's the admissions office is doing one thing, and then maybe the TRIO office is doing one thing, and then maybe there's a mentor program through the orientation office, but maybe Res Life is doing their own thing. That does not going to truly move first gen forward. If we are going to truly move first gen forward across our campuses, we have to think like the hamburger here. Be more like the hamburger. Instead of lining your Legos up here, be more like the hamburger and think about, what does this intersection look like? How can Campus Rec partner with the Res Life first gen living and learning community that they have? How can we do something there? How can we partner with our student health and wellness center when we think about the physical and mental health and wellness and resiliency of first gen students? How can we be a part of the campus-wide first gen celebration day, even if that only piece is just the campus rec center social media accounts publicly posting, we are proud, we are excited to celebrate with you on this day for first gen celebration day. How can we be more like the hamburger and less like lining up all the Legos on our own campuses? So I think we've got like 6 more minutes here. And my question is, I go back to that original question that I started this session is, how will you move #FirstGen forward on your campus? What will that look like? And my charge to you right now is take 60 seconds and just write it down. It's very difficult. I've been in so many virtual conferences since we've been in this pandemic. Like, it's easy to go to a virtual conference and then hop right back on and get to all those emails that are left in our inbox. So I feel like if we can write it down for yourself, write it on a sticky note, put it somewhere, on your monitor. You're more likely to accomplish that strategy. So what's the one thing that you're going to walk away from this session and you're going to say, like, I'm going to do this one thing? You're not going to change the world. If you change the world, that's awesome. But we all can't change the world overnight. But what's one thing that you can do after this session to go back and move #FirstGen forward on your campus? So I encourage you to take 60 seconds, write it down. If you want to share it in the chat box with our community of peers here, that's a great way to hold each other accountable. But I'd love for you to take 60 seconds and just jot down, what's that one thing that you're going to do to move #FirstGen forward on your campus? If anybody would love to share what their one strategy is, love to hear it, or you want to type it into the chat box, love to see some of those. What's your one thing you're going to do to move #FirstGen forward on your campus, within your department? Less side-by-side Legos. Love that. Less, be the hamburger. Be the hamburger. Get a seat at the table if your boss will let you. Carrie, you can have a seat at the FirstGen table. Absolutely. Jargon. Absolutely. Great strategy, Melissa. Start with jargon. See if anything needs to be changed. Run it by your students. Our students know more, they're more open and honest than ever. So ask them, like, look at our website. Tell me what doesn't make sense. Like, absolutely. Create accessible registrations. Minimize the assumption that FirstGen students have access or know how to access different technologies to complete registrations. Absolutely. FirstGen giveaways. Encourage them to stop by and see what the rec has to offer. Absolutely. My guess is they're going to find those connection opportunities. So maybe a FirstGen giveaway on FirstGen celebration day or week or whenever that looks like is a great way to entice them over to your space. Absolutely. For some of you, your one strategy may be asking the question, how do we define FirstGen on our campus? Answer the call for opportunities to partner. For FirstGen Celebration Day, looks like Cecilian is hosting a couple of virtual events that feature FirstGen student staff, intramural sports panel, group fitness class. Love it. Awesome opportunities. So we've got a few minutes left here for Q&A or thoughts. So what are your thoughts? Like I said, you all are our leaders across the region in terms of collegiate recreation. So what are your thoughts, your questions, your aha moments regarding how do we best consider engaging FirstGen students in collegiate recreation?
Hey, Brett, it's me from Emporia State again. This is Daniel. I think this is a question maybe for everyone. We're facing right now a lot of other departments on campus, those collaborations. Although we've been fairly successful at them in the past, they're just wanting to continue to beat the dead horse of staying virtual. And students are begging to do something safely in person. And has there been any success, or has anyone else had any success? And is it okay that I ask this question, I guess, because I think it kind of goes with it, but has anyone had any success with making some of those partnerships and collaboration this year specifically, maybe in a setting that people want to continue to just stay virtual?
Great question. Other thoughts?
So maybe we're not the only people facing this problem.
Looks like some people are working on more in-person events pending approval. Carrie can't unmute himself.
I think one issue that we have is every department has different ways they view things. I mean, we have a set standard at the university, and we felt like we were in the guidelines of the set standards. I know Brett and I have had this conversation. We were in the set standard guidelines, and we have things approved, and then things happened when we started doing intramurals. And so now we've had to redo our standards after school started and we started doing intramurals. People had issues with things that we were doing. And so it just makes it hard for us to know what another department's guidelines might be of even asking them, because you don't know if they're going to want to collaborate or whatnot. So that's the issue I've personally been having. So I don't know if anybody else has had those issues at all or not.
Looks like Ken has shared some thoughts in the chat box there about they're playing some sports, sand volleyball, can jam, kickball, softball, the mask worn and social distancing, glow in the dark events this week with putt-putt. Any other thoughts or questions when we think about considerations for engaging first-gen students in this work on our campuses? So there's a question about, is there information on use of counseling centers by first-gen students versus continuing generation students? Yes, there is research on that. I don't have that research readily at my fingertips, but if you email me, I know there's articles about that for sure, and so I'm happy to connect you with some of those resources for sure. I think we've got time for one more question or thought. Was this helpful to start this conversation about how do we consider first-gen students in our work that we're doing in collegiate recreation? Well, if there are other ways that I can be a resource, or if you want the slide deck to have all of the full detailed notes, the lit review, all of those types of pieces, happy to connect. My email is on the screen. So always happy to connect and share any and all of the research regarding first-gen students and what's happening on our campuses. So with that, I'll turn it back over to our session host.
All right, well, thank you so much for that presentation. I know I took a lot from that, so